The 2019 novel coronavirus that emerged in China has the international community reeling with fears of what comes next. To understand the concerns and mitigate the unknown, Just Saying examines the impact of outbreaks, epidemics, and pandemics. Welcome, Just Sayers. I'm Allison Cartervold, here to tell you how that with a new year came a new virus emerging from a yet unknown origin that has deadly consequences. We are going to dive into Wuhan and beyond, but first I want to let you know how excited we are that you chose to give us a chance to give you the gist on complicated stories that are generally underreported. In turn, we ask that you follow us on the website, your favorite podcast platform, and social media. All of the pertinent links you need are available to you in the show notes and on our website, which is justsaying.com. That's GISTSAYN.com. All right, let's get started. On December 31st, 2019, China informed the World Health Organization, or WHO, of several strange cases of pneumonia in Wuhan City. The virus causing them did not seem to match any other known viruses. On January 7th, just a week later, Chinese authorities confirmed that they had identified a new coronavirus. Members of the vast family of coronaviruses range in severity to include everything from the common cold to the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS, that emerged in 2012, and severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, that emerged in 2003. The temporary name of this new virus is the 2019 novel coronavirus. Rolls right off the tongue, right? They'll rename it, or it will get stuck with a name that people just start calling it as time goes on. Coronaviruses are common in many different species of animals, including camels, cattle, cats, and bats. Though it is rare, animal coronaviruses can jump from an animal reservoir to infect people and then begin to spread from person to person, such as was the case with MERS and SARS. Experts now believe this is also the case with the novel coronavirus. According to Chinese officials, in December, early patients with this outbreak of respiratory illness linked back to a large seafood and live animal market located in Wuhan, a Chinese city of 11 million people. This link suggests an initial animal-to-person spread. As the outbreak continued, a growing number of patients became infected without having exposure to animal markets, which indicates the virus became able to spread person to person, a fact that has been confirmed by the rapid spread of the disease across Wuhan and beyond. From the day it was informed, the WHO began working with Chinese authorities and global experts to study the virus, to learn how it affects the people it infects, how they can be treated, and what countries can do to slow it down and to protect their citizens. The WHO reports that as of February 7th, the 2019 novel coronavirus has infected more than 31,000 people, with thousands of new cases being added each day. 99% of all these cases are currently still in China, but 24 other countries have reported about 200 additional cases. A confirmed 638 people have already died from the virus. All but one of them was in China. If you would like to look at a day-by-day timeline of the spread of the virus so far, you should go to the website at justsaying.com and click on the accompanying article for this podcast. As always, I have an article that has links to the various sites where I did my research before getting on air here and doing the podcast. So go there and you can see this particular one is from Pharmaceutical Technology, and they do a pretty good job of updating the day-by-day results that are ever-changing right now. The numbers continue to rise despite the fact that China has made unprecedented efforts to sequester tens of millions of its citizens in multiple cities. In addition, numerous countries, including the United States, are severely limiting travel to and from the communist nation. Even so, it seems the location of the emergence of this outbreak gave the virus a head start. When a doctor, an ophthalmologist, as it happens, in Wuhan first saw a disturbing number of what he thought was SARS cases pop up in December, he decided to share the information with former classmates on a closed chat, advising them to be on the lookout and take precautions. He thought he had a patient that might have this. Within days, police came to him to issue him a formal sanction. They ordered him to stop rumor mongering, and they threatened him. Even if you can get past the fact that China's government was actively monitoring the doctor's private chat, it is, after all, a way of life in the socialist regime, you must also try to understand why the doctors were threatened rather than applauded for their vigilance. We don't know their motives, but by trying to suppress the facts, Chinese authorities gave the virus a better chance to spread. Now that the outbreak is an epidemic, on the brink, frankly, of being a pandemic, the communist government is looking for ways to mitigate economic and diplomatic losses. And the economic losses are already significant and are going to continue to be significant. On February 3rd, Beijing accused the United States of spreading fear over the novel corona outbreak by pulling its embassy personnel and nationals out of China and restricting travel instead of offering significant aid. A claim, by the way, that the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, says is incorrect. During a briefing on February 3rd, Dr. Nancy Messenger, director of the CDC National Center for Respiratory Diseases, said they had indeed extended an offer of expertise to China.
There still are negotiations in process on that, and really we're waiting. As soon as we are allowed to go, we will be there. And I think that we at CDC have incredibly strong scientists who have a lot of technical experience in really similar diseases as well as in these kind of diseases, and our presence on the ground in China would be a help to the folks in China who are trying to unravel this thing and make the best recommendations possible for their country and the world. And I would certainly, what I've seen is that in situations like this, science should trump everything else, and that's certainly what we're hoping, is that the scientific expertise of the larger global community will be able to be brought to bear on this really complicated, difficult situation that our colleagues in China are dealing with.
So politically, China is still being China. No surprise there. However, even though it could have perhaps acted quicker to share information about the virus with the international medical community, it has indeed acted faster than in past situations to try and contain the outbreak, for which the medical community is giving China high praise. On January 30th, Dr. Tedros, General Director of the World Health Organization, had this to say.
Over the past few weeks, we have witnessed the emergence of a previously unknown pathogen, which has escalated into an unprecedented outbreak and which has been met by an unprecedented response. As I have said repeatedly since my return from Beijing, the Chinese government is to be congratulated for the extraordinary measures it has taken to contain the outbreak, despite the severe social and economic impact those measures are having on the Chinese people. We would have seen many more cases outside China by now, and probably deaths, if it were not for the government's efforts and the progress they have made to protect their own people and the people of the world. The speed with which China detected the outbreak, isolated the virus, sequenced the genome, and shared it with WHO and the world are very impressive and beyond words.
As an aside, given that China has bioengineering labs in Wuhan, there have been unsubstantiated claims that the virus somehow emerged from one of them. This could explain the speed at which they identified and sequenced the virus, but again, there is no proof of this. The doctor said other things were impressive about China as well.
So is China's commitment to transparency and to supporting other countries. In many ways, China is actually setting a new standard for outbreak response, and it's not an exaggeration.
Unfortunately, the spread of the virus has continued to pick up speed, so, and this is the critical part,
we don't know what sort of damage this virus could do if it were to spread in a country with a weaker health system. We must act now to help countries prepare for that possibility. For all of these reasons, I'm declaring a public health emergency of international concern over the global outbreak of novel coronavirus. The main reason for this declaration is not because of what is happening in China, but because of what is happening in other countries.
The declaration of a global public health emergency is not something the WHO takes lightly, but the formula used as to when to declare one can be hard to follow. This is only the 5th time the World Health Organization has invoked a global public health emergency since the H1N1 or swine flu outbreak in 2009. In that year-long pandemic, more than 12,000 people died just in the United States, and it's estimated between 151,000 and 575,000 people perished worldwide. In 2014, the WHO released 2 public health emergencies of international concern. First, there was the one that followed the re-emergence of a higher than average number of polio cases, 400 of them in 2013, which was spreading into new countries. Then later that year, one was issued for Ebola. The 2014 West African Ebola outbreak lasted until 2016, with more than 28,000 cases and more than 11,000 deaths. It was the deadliest Ebola outbreak in history. In 2016, while Brazil prepared to host the Olympics, the alarms sounded again as a Zika virus outbreak engulfed all of South America and continued to creep everywhere that the mosquitoes that transmit it can survive, even into the United States. Then in August of 2018, Ebola again gained ground in Africa. This ongoing outbreak is the 10th one faced by the Democratic Republic of Congo. As the risk that the deadly virus might spread beyond Africa increased, the WHO declared the outbreak as an international public health emergency in July of 2019. It took them almost a year to do that. Because even though it was bad, it was happening in one area that has seen this virus before. As you can see, all these cases had different elements that led to a global declaration of emergency. Determining when an outbreak becomes an epidemic and then advances to be classified a pandemic is also not a pure numbers game. It's not about just how long an outbreak has gone on or how many cases an outbreak has. According to the World Health Organization, an outbreak is the occurrence of disease cases that goes above normal expectations. The number of cases it takes to be called an outbreak varies according to the disease-causing agent itself and the size and type of previous and or existing exposure to the agent. Okay? Disease is opportunistic. So outbreaks can result from a variety of reasons that include humanitarian crisis, forced migration, environmental degradation, reduced access to health services, and trying to survive in zones of prolonged conflict. A disease does not have to be unknown or untreatable to have an outbreak. Diphtheria, a bacterial disease that is preventable through a simple, inexpensive vaccine, is one such example. Once it affected millions, but in recent decades, it faced eradication. Yet now it's making a dramatic comeback, and not only among refugees forced to live in unsafe, unsanitary conditions, but in other vulnerable communities as well. Outbreaks can also have seasonal patterns, like with the flu. To better understand how things are classified, you need a working knowledge of the definitions. Okay, so here's a quick tutorial. If a disease's occurrences are infrequent and irregular, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, calls them sporadic. Okay, that makes sense. However, a disease or infection that maintains a constant and/or prevalent presence within a defined geographic area is considered endemic. It's always kind of hanging around. It's endemic to the population or the place. When a disease causes a sudden increase in the number of cases that is greater than expected in a given population, the outbreak becomes an epidemic. That's what's happened in China. You went from 0 to tens of thousands in 2 months. An epidemic that has spread over several countries or continents, affecting a large number of people in them, should be labeled a pandemic. All right, this is according to the CDC. What's happening in China right now is definitely an epidemic. And even though there's 24 other countries that have reported cases of this virus, it's not yet a pandemic because there's so few cases there. So it not only has to spread beyond the borders, but there has to be more cases before they're going to label it a pandemic. When an epidemic is officially redefined as a pandemic, the most significant difference is that more governments are involved in attempting to prevent the progression of the disease and potentially treat the people who have it. According to the CDC, in the United States, once it's classified as a pandemic, the FDA can also begin issuing what are called emergency use authorizations, or EUAs. This allows doctors to use medications outside of the normal FDA approval use. For example, during the swine flu pandemic, the FDA issued EUAs for 2 antiviral drugs trying to prevent the flu in young children and to treat patients who had symptoms for more than 2 days. This was something which Tamiflu had not previously been used for, but desperate times, they went ahead and tried anyways. It takes masterful medical detective work, rapid and coordinated international information sharing, and resources with deep pockets and influence to stem the spread of a rapidly emerging disease. These things are critical. History is full of cautionary tales of what can happen when diseases spread unchecked. You don't believe me? Well, here's a short list. Plague is one of the oldest and most feared of all diseases. Like the shark and the crocodile, the plague was such an effective killer, it had little reason to evolve. It just kept making the rounds. Historically, the plague has been responsible for several widespread pandemics with very high mortality rates. During the 14th century, it was known as the Black Death, causing more than 50 million deaths across Europe. 50 million. It resurfaced in 1665 for the Great Plague of London to kill 20% of the city's population. They had to use mass graves to bury the dead, and fear caused the slaughter of thousands of cats and dogs. The outbreak eventually tapered off in 1665. Science has since taught us that the plague is primarily carried by rats that have developed an immunity to it. And it is most frequently transferred to humans, not by rats themselves, but by fleas that have tried to feed on the rats first. That knowledge alone has helped mitigate the plague's ability to spread. Nowadays, plague is pretty easy to prevent and is treatable with antibiotics if detected early enough. Plus, infection can be prevented through the use of standard precautions. Even so, believe it or not, it is still around. For example, it appears annually in Madagascar, where thousands are routinely infected and hundreds die. Despite the relative ease of treatment, the CDC says the plague's association with the Black Death still weighs very heavy on the popular consciousness, and its outbreaks are therefore regularly cited in media reports and even tabloid headlines. They hate that it gets overblown. The CDC also points to this as an example of the gravity of elevating outbreaks to epidemics and epidemics to pandemics. It believes it's essential to strike a balance between encouraging countries to be ready to act in case of an outbreak while avoiding panic that could result in unnecessary or counterproductive measures such as trade restrictions or travel bans on affected countries. While the plague remains basically the same disease it has been for centuries, other bacteria and viruses are not content to rest on past achievements. They are always evolving, trying to outwit and outmatch the human immune system. Perhaps with designs to overthrow the plague as the world's most prolific illness and killer, the flu grew to pandemic levels 5 times in less than 100 years. It started as the Spanish flu, so known because during World War I, Spain was the only country that allowed its press to cover the story freely. Everybody else had embargoes because they didn't want the other side to know how many of their soldiers were sick. The Spanish flu spread around the world in a pandemic beginning in 1918. According to the CDC, this especially virulent H1N1 influenza rapidly affected and caused severe lung damage. It came from an avian or bird reservoir, but the virus's exact origin remains unclear. One of the possibilities is an army base in the United States that later deployed troops to Europe. However it got there, once the pathogen reached the trenches of World War I, there was no stopping it. The CDC estimates that about 500 million people, a full third of the world's population at the time, became infected with this virus. Worldwide, it caused at least 50 million deaths. 50 million. That's a global figure that eclipses all the lives claimed by the violence of World War I, which was around 17 million. The flu retook center stage on a pandemic scale in 1957 as the Asian flu. This H2N2 strain began in East Asia. By April, it made its way from Singapore to Hong Kong, and then it appeared in coastal cities in the United States by summer. So it took it several months to get across the Pacific. In that pandemic, an estimated 1.1 million people died of the Asian flu worldwide, and 116,000 of those deaths occurred in the United States. But wait, there's more. About 10 years later, the ever-changing flu virus again reinvented itself as the Hong Kong flu. This one originated in China in July of 1968, caused by an influenza A virus, H3N2, This third pandemic flu outbreak to occur in the 20th century killed 1 million people worldwide and about 100,000 people in the United States. So even after that first really big one, it was taking out millions of people at a shot when it came back around. That brings us to the most recent flu pandemic, initially known as the swine flu. It emerged in 2009 as a novel H1N1 influenza virus previously unidentified in either humans or animals. Sound familiar? The virus first was detected in the United States, and it spread quickly across the country and the world. The CDC says that between April 2009 and April 2010, in just 1 year, there were over 60 million cases, almost 275,000 hospitalizations, and more than 12,000 deaths in just the United States. CDC estimates that up to 500,000 people died worldwide. Unlike previous outbreaks, older adults often had immunity to this flu, likely from earlier exposure to a similar H1N1 virus, they think. This time, those primarily affected by the flu pandemic of 2009 were middle-aged adults and children. The pandemic officially ended on October 10th in 2010, but the virus continues to circulate as a seasonal flu virus, causing illness, hospitalization, and deaths around the globe every year. WHO officials say every year up to 650,000 people die, while 3 to 5 million battle severe flu infections. 1 billion more suffer milder effects. The flu is an ever-changing, deadly foe. So we have to be ever vigilant, right? In this age of air travel that allows unknown contagions to skip undetected across continents in hours rather than weeks, months, or years, the CDC knew it was not going to stop this new coronavirus from reaching the United States. However, it does want to slow it down long enough to mitigate its impact. While work on a vaccine is underway, the United States is taking aggressive precautions. The government has chartered flights to bring U.S. employees, citizens, and dependents back from China, and is then quarantining them on military bases for at least 14 days. It stopped commercial airline flights to China. It is refusing entry to any foreigners that recently traveled to China that are not permanent residents of the U.S. or family members of U.S. citizens. Others who made their way to the United States before becoming ill are being closely monitored by local health authorities who remain in contact with the CDC. They're tracking them. The dozen or so cases currently being treated across the United States show a vast degree of severity. Dr. Nancy Messenger, director of CDC National Center for Respiratory Diseases, had this to say during a recent telephone briefing.
We have seen a spectrum of illness among the cases in the U.S. Some of them seem pretty mild. At least a few have, at least at some point in the course of their illness, been more severely ill. And there have been some ups and downs in the course of these patients that are sicker. I would note that there is no deaths in the United States. Some of our patients have had oxygen requirements during the course of their illness. There is the first death outside China now reported. And the data coming out of China continues to say that the people who are at higher risk for severe disease and death are those who are older and with underlying health conditions. And so obviously, we'll need to wait and hope that we don't see that level of severity here in the United States. Our clinical folks broadly are working on doing everything we can to make sure that those patients get the optimal care that we can provide to them.
Okay, so here's the gist. Since I started research for this podcast, things have been in constant flux. Initial reports indicate this virus spreads easily, through close contact and airborne contamination similar to a flu virus. And you don't have to feel sick to be contagious. That's one of the problems. Initial data also indicates that the 2019 novel coronavirus has a lower mortality rate than other coronaviruses. This is good news because it means fewer people will die when they contract it than those who catch, say, MERS or SARS. But scientists are concerned that if many people only get mild symptoms, the virus can spread very quickly because they don't realize they're spreading it. And they, feel good. When you feel good, you're up and moving around and have contact with more people. And what happens then is as that virus spreads quickly, it can mutate into a more lethal strain. New viruses are very unpredictable, and initial findings can change or can be inaccurate. Remember that Chinese doctor I told you about? I believe his name is pronounced Li Wenliang. He's the one who was initially treated as a criminal for sounding an early alarm. Well, he is now being called a whistleblower. That's great, but it's too late. He contracted the virus while treating patients. He was sick in the hospital for weeks, and unfortunately, on February 7th, he reportedly succumbed to the disease and died. His death is tragic, and it is also concerning for several reasons. He seemed to be a healthy 34-year-old who began getting medical care early. And even though he claimed to take precautions so as not to infect his pregnant wife, she is now in an ICU. This makes people worry that the disease is more deadly and more aggressive than the data out of China is indicating. And that's the kind of thing that makes rumors. So rumors abound. Most prominent among them is the fear that the Chinese government is not being transparent with information related to the severity of the epidemic, which has engulfed the entire nation and is causing citizens to question the communist government harshly, which in and of itself can be a health hazard. The most conspiratorial rumor is that police killed the doctor and are blaming his death on the virus to cover it up. People in China are so upset, the Chinese government has announced an investigation into the quote-unquote issues surrounding his death. That in and of itself is pretty unusual for the government. The bottom line is, it's a mess over there. By any measure, China's outbreak is now an epidemic. Despite China's unprecedented efforts to contain it, the virus has reached from Wuhan to cross the international boundaries of at least 24 countries. Once the numbers in those countries rise, the World Health Organization will have no choice but to call it what it is fast becoming: a pandemic. It's okay to agree or disagree. I'm just saying. All right, that's it for now. If there are any really significant changes in this story, we will bring you an update. Otherwise, we'll move on to a new subject, and we'll hope that you join us for that. In the meantime, make sure you like and follow the website and podcast. Thank you very much. Take care, and God bless.